All right. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great event on tap. I am so excited about this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use the question and answer tab on your interface and go ahead and submit your questions. And we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We're also going to be kicking things off with a poll question, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged with that. And at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, we will go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is the hidden cost of open source. Our speakers today are Elisa, who is the VP of Engineering Operations at Fairwinds, and Robert Brennan, who's the Director of Open Source at Fairwinds. Guys, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlene.
Thanks so much for having us.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, I know we're going to start with a polling question. So, Elisa, I'll just dive in and I'll open it up for everybody. Start the polling, and you should, the audience should be able to see it on your screen now under the polls tab. The question is, where are you on your Kubernetes journey? You can go ahead and make your choice from learning about containers in Kubernetes, have spun up a test cluster, have started using it in pre-production, using it in production, or I'm a Kubernetes expert. So go ahead and make your choice, and I'll leave the poll open for a couple of minutes and let folks go ahead and make their choice. And then, Elisa, I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you dive right on into your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlene. Robert, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Yeah, so I'm Robert Brennan. I'm Director of Open Source Software here at Fairwinds. I basically drive all of our software initiatives here. We have both about half a dozen open source projects out in the wild, and then I work on a commercial platform that integrates them and tries to make them a little bit more user-friendly.
Awesome. And I'm Elisa Hebert. I'm the VP of Engineering Operations at Fairwinds. I oversee the full footprint of engineering from the software through the services. A little bit about Fairwinds before we kick things off. We provide software and managed services to help companies ship cloud native applications faster, more effectively and efficiently, and with less risk. And to do that, we have sort of a 3-pronged approach. One is commercial software called Insights. Another is a fairly large open source footprint. And then third is services, mostly leaning into the managed service space.
Well, so I've been working in software now for over a decade, and I've probably split my time pretty evenly between commercial and open source software. So I've seen a lot of the pros and cons of both of them. And at Fairwinds as well, we pretty much split our time between open source and commercial. As I said before, we have about half a dozen different open source projects that we put out into the wild for the community to use. Then we also work on commercial software to help round out those offerings with some more enterprise-grade features.
Sorry, I was a little slow there. So before we jump in here to the conversation, I want to give people 1 more minute to take that poll, and then I'm going to read out the results. So far, it looks like it's leaning pretty heavily into that first bucket, which is learning about containers in Kubernetes. A couple people have spun up a test cluster or using it in pre-production, and then a little more than 20% of folks are using it in production already, and no one willing to click that button saying I'm a Kubernetes expert just yet. So we appreciate folks' input there. It helps us think a little bit about part of the conversation here today. So we think about the decision point here. We're going to talk through sort of the difference between adopting something free or working with a commercial partner, either from a services perspective or a software perspective, to validate and ensure your success. Robert, you want to sort of talk through your thinking a little bit? You own both sides of the house for us, right? The commercial software and the open source footprint. So maybe you can talk a little bit about high level your thoughts there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about modern development is that we can rely on third parties to take care of a lot of the most boilerplate parts of application development. So if you want to create a new application, you don't have to write your own database. There are tools and partners out there that can help you with authentication, with your deployment strategy, with doing things like security scanning. So you don't have to do all that stuff yourself. Often those tools are available as free open source software, which you can just take off the shelf and run, which is awesome. It makes it really easy to get an application off the ground up and running really quickly, so that you can focus on your core competency and what you do well and delivering great features to your users, rather than doing all that sort of boilerplate work. But as you pick up these open source projects to help you solve these specific problems, you really need to take into account the cost of setup, the cost of long-term maintenance, and potential issues around security and reliability as you deploy them. I've seen a lot of times companies or individuals as they create a project and pick off some of these open source solutions to help them solve point problems. They'll see that it's free and think that it's going to be free forever. But the truth of the matter is, you end up paying for a lot of it with your time and with potential headaches down the line. So oftentimes it does make sense to find a commercial partner to help you either with the open source you've decided to use, or to help you set up a commercial solution around the problem. And basically the trade-off there is that you're paying them to take on a lot of those hard to measure costs. So instead of paying with your time, you pay with money.
Awesome. So Robert talked a little bit about the sort of three buckets that we're going to look at today. So setup, maintenance, and then security and reliability. And for each one, we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like in an open source environment, and then a little bit about what it looks like in a commercial environment. So the first one here, we're going to talk about setup. So using an open source solution and what those costs look like. There's decisions that you need to make around what packages to use, integrating them with your stack, configuration, etc. So maybe Robert, you can talk us through your thinking on this piece.
Yeah. So if you have a problem you need to solve, and you've maybe figured out what open source solution you want to deploy there, you really need to develop some in-house expertise on what that software does, how to configure it, how to run it. Say you've chosen to use Postgres as your database, you're going to need somebody internally who knows Postgres in and out. So the place you'll really want to start is just doing research. Likely you'll want to have somebody on your team working on this full time, or at least half time, just digging into the software, experimenting with it. A lot of times, open source software will come with some, quick copy paste, quick start instructions to kind of get you up and running and feel like you're running. But if you just use those quick start instructions for everything, you're asking for problems down the line. You really need to understand, how to configure the software so that it's secure, so that it works inside of your environment, and all that. In addition to that, you're going to have to figure out how to train the larger organization on the software. So in addition to having one, or a couple in-house experts, you're going to want the larger organization to understand the software, how to interact with it, et cetera. You may also need to, provision infrastructure to run the software. You may need to, spend those first, weeks or months as you set up the software, really tuning your setup, refining the configuration, et cetera.
So as a leader in an engineering space, when I'm thinking about, the human cost of standing something up that might be, cash free, I might make a budget that is separated by some of these different buckets that you talked about, and then think through the skill sets of the team that I have, the skill sets that I don't have, and how much effort each one of those are going to take. Does that sound about right?
It does, yeah. The tough thing is that it can be very hard to estimate exactly, what, how big to make those buckets. This is the place where there are, a lot of unknown unknowns. So for, even for well-known software that's been used widely, it can be very hard to estimate exactly what it's going to take to adapt that software to your business. For instance, we work in the Kubernetes space, and we've seen companies take months to years to actually figure out how to set up Kubernetes in a way that works for them, because it's a very big, complex system. So there can be a lot of trial and error that goes on here, and this is, I would say, where we see the most cost overruns, or budget overruns, in terms of what people are budgeting time wise.
Awesome. Thanks. That's helpful framing. So on the flip side, thinking about the setup costs related to a commercial partner or a piece of commercial software, can you talk a little bit about what the differences are there? I mean, the most obvious one is like cash versus time, right? But talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the great thing about a commercial partner is that they have that in-house expertise that you would have needed to build on your own. So a commercial partner can very quickly, talk to you, talk to management, talk to your engineering team, get a sense for what your environment is like, what your specific needs are, and map those to the open source solution or commercial solution that they work with. You're basically, at this point in the journey, paying for their expertise and their knowledge. Oftentimes a commercial partner will have seen, all the different ways that this software can be configured, all the different ways that it can go wrong. They'll spot a lot of the landmines that you might not have spotted yourself, because they have the battle scars. They've done this before many, many times in many different ways. So a commercial partner could really help streamline this part of the process. Often it just is a 30 to 60-minute meeting where you're explaining your needs, and they can immediately come back with what you need to be doing in order to be successful with this solution.
Great. So we're going to move on to the next one, which is focusing on maintenance. So sort of the same thought process. Once you've stood up the piece of software and you've got it running, now you have to maintain it. What does the cost structure look like there?
So yeah, I would say the maintenance costs really fall into two buckets. The first bucket would be upkeep. So just, making sure that the application doesn't go down, making sure that it's, regularly updated, so that if there are security patches that come out, or anything else, that you're, grabbing those updates and installing them. Making sure that that process is in place is super important for security reasons, especially. And then, be prepared for, as your environment changes, as your needs change, you may have to reconfigure the application to work with it. Maybe you're moving clouds or something like that. There's always going to be some cost to just making sure that software stays up and running.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Did I interrupt you?
No worries. I was going to say the other half of the coin is expansion, where, as the software becomes more critical to your business and more people within your business start using it, they're going to want new features. They're going to want new things. They're going to want to integrate it elsewhere in their workflow. So you may need to spend time, reconfiguring the software. You may need to spend time building automation around it, building integrations with, say, like Slack or Jira. You may even need to end up contributing back to the code base in order to, get the features that your team really needs in order to be successful.
So, as our leader in the open source space at Fairwinds, and, our sort of focus is Kubernetes, maybe you can give some examples on the open source side, in terms of what maintenance costs might be for even some of the projects that we've deployed, if someone was trying to leverage them in their organization.
Yeah, for sure. So Kubernetes itself is on a quarterly release schedule. So once you get Kubernetes, core Kubernetes up and running in your environment, you're basically going to be, hitting every quarter the need to update. And Kubernetes goes out of support after about a year or so. So taking care of those updates as quickly as possible is super important. They come with security patches. They come with new features. They deprecate old features. Often the migration from one version to another can be very painful. especially if they're deprecating features that you've been using or deprecating particular resource types that you've been using. And it can take, engineer weeks, I would say, typically a Kubernetes upgrade. Some of them are painless. Some of them, are easy where they don't deprecate anything. But at worst, probably an engineer month will get spent on Kubernetes. But on top of that, there are probably at least half a dozen different tools you're going to need to install on top of Kubernetes to do things like certificate management, ingress, managing DNS records, things like that. And keeping all that up to date as well. Each of those tools is on their own release cycle, et cetera. So it can be really a full-time job trying to keep a cluster and all of its add-ons up to date.
So again, sort of, that flip side of commercial partnering or commercial software, the maintenance obviously has a cash component versus what feels a little overwhelming human effort component that you just described. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the commercial side.
Yeah. So the nice thing about a commercial partner here is that, they have developed expertise around this software explicitly. It is their core competency. So they can do the maintenance aspect of things, keeping it up and running, developing new features, et cetera. They can do that a lot faster than you can. And so that there's some natural savings there. If you convert your time to dollars, it's, you're obviously going to be paying for it, but it makes it a lot easier to just kind of not have to deal with the unbounded or hard to estimate amount of effort for maintenance costs and push that onto somebody else for a known dollar cost. It's especially helpful if the solution is running like as a SaaS, because then you don't need to worry about any kind of uptime on your end. You've got a whole team of people who are making sure the software is up and running, it's secure, the data is getting backed up, et cetera, which can be super helpful.
So you just talked a little bit about security, and that feels like sort of the thing we could spend, a whole webinar on in and of itself. And this is a place that people feel a lot of, I think, anxiety, either in the open source space or even in the, commercial partner space. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that works, and on the open source side, how does disaster planning work specifically?
Yeah, so I would say that the security and reliability costs are potentially really difficult to measure and unbounded. In general, I would say there's three questions you should be asking yourself here as you deploy a solution. One is the security impact. If the service were misconfigured, if an attacker managed to get access to it, or even worse than that, use it as an entry point into your environment, what would the impact of that be? Could user data be exposed? Could your servers be exposed? Or is it just a developer tool that's sitting in some way separated from your production environment? So that's a big question you want to ask yourself. The next one I would say is around data loss. So if you were to lose the underlying data from this service, what would the cost be there? Are you backing things up? Are you checking those backups, et cetera? Understanding how easily you could recover from data loss and what the impact of data loss would be is super important as you deploy an open source solution. And then the last piece is really around downtime. So if this service goes down, stops working, is that going to affect your customers? Is it going to slow down your engineering team? Is it kind of just going to be a blip that nobody notices? I think asking that question is really important, especially as your usage of the software increases over time and it becomes a bigger and more important part of your business. If it could lead to a production outage for your customers, for instance, that's definitely something you will want documented. You want to have a disaster plan in place for that. Do you have monitoring and alerting in place for the application? That sort of stuff is really important to ask.
So again, sort of focusing on the Kubernetes side specifically, maybe you can talk a little bit about security and reliability concerns in that space.
For sure, yeah. So Kubernetes, typically is used to run all of your production infrastructure, all of your production applications. So making sure that that is secure is super important, because it means protecting your users' data, protecting database secrets, things like that. So making sure that Kubernetes itself is configured properly is super important. Y'all might have heard there was a recent vulnerability announced where people were finding crypto mining injections in their Kubernetes clusters because the clusters had been poorly configured. And again, on top of Kubernetes itself, you've got maybe half a dozen different add-ons that are being layered on top to solve different solutions, solve different problems, and making sure those are all up to date and configured properly for security reasons. Again, super duper important. Data loss, hopefully not as much of a problem in Kubernetes, because if you're doing Kubernetes the Fairwinds way, at least, it's your clusters and workloads should all be ephemeral. You should be able to tear down the cluster and rebuild it from scratch without losing any data or losing any context. There are cases where there are good reasons to store data inside of a Kubernetes cluster. Say run a database inside of a Kubernetes cluster, something like that. We typically recommend against it, specifically for the data loss problem, but some folks do it. So making sure you've got backups set up using a project like Valero from Heptio, now VMware, or Gemini is one of our products for doing Kubernetes backups. Super important. And then in terms of downtime, again, this is running your organization's workloads. It's running all your production applications. So downtime is super important. You want to ensure that you've got alerting and monitoring in place, so that if problems start to crop up inside the Kubernetes cluster, your team is getting paged. They're getting alerted to it before it actually takes things down. A lapse in the core Kubernetes infrastructure could take down a production application. It could stop you from deploying an update, things like that. So making sure that Kubernetes stays up and running is a really hard problem, and one you'll definitely want to have a plan in place for.
Great. Now, when we flip again over to the commercial side, it sounds like there's a lot of risk in play. My experience buying software or deciding that, that build versus buy, which in this case would be like free versus buy, right? There's a lot of focus on that risk, and frankly, when you buy, you get to offload it onto somebody else. So, which is appealing. So talk a little bit about that from the commercial side.
Yeah, so I think using your commercial partner really like as an insurance plan is a great way to think about it. They, instead of you having to shoulder the burden of making sure everything's secure, making sure your data is backed up, making sure things aren't going down and causing outages, you don't have to think about all that. You can push it onto them, and they have a whole team of people who, again, understand this solution in and out. They've got the battle scars to prove it. They understand all the different ways it could go wrong. They understand how to configure it securely, et cetera. So really what you're paying them for is peace of mind. You can trust that they've got a whole team of people who are thinking every day about how to keep this secure, how to keep the data intact, how to make sure it stays up and running 24/7.
So you talked a little bit about security and reliability in the abstract when it comes to a commercial partner. And, we're a commercial partner, right? So we have both an open source footprint and a commercial footprint. Can you talk a little bit about Fairwinds' approach in specific?
Yeah, so like on the security side, for instance, we have a security team, I should say a whole team of people who are focused, on security. We have a rotating security officer who monitors all the CVE feeds out there to make sure that if there is a new CVE in Kubernetes that could affect our clients, that gets bubbled up to those clients. We also put together, if there is a CVE that is something that affects our clients, we put together an action plan. We specify exactly what that client is going to need to do in order to mitigate the CVE, whether it's upgrade Kubernetes or put a particular policy in place, things like that. So we're able to very quickly develop a response to new vulnerabilities that get announced. We also, on the software side, we have a really strong backup policy in place. We keep historical records of every audit that goes through our infrastructure. We have very strong practices around data retention. Again, not things that probably much more than any individual Kubernetes user puts in place, unless you're like super enterprise grade and you have the resources to have a whole team of SREs thinking about Kubernetes all the time. We've also built in a lot of alerting and monitoring, so that if things go wrong, we get alerted very quickly. Again, this is where the battle scars really start to come into play, because every time there is an issue, and there's always, everybody's got a different environment, everybody's got something different going on. If there is an issue, we know how to, write new alerts around that issue and make sure that we get alerted to it, every time it might happen in the future. So having that, very strong alerting, the strong alerting instincts, I think is a great reason to think about Fairwinds as a commercial partner when running Kubernetes.
Awesome. So chuckling as I'm reading the chat, and Eric, you're going to appreciate this next slide, I think. So Eric's comment in the chat was, there is free as in free beer, and then there is free as in free puppy, which I think is pretty funny. I think he might win for the quote. So can you talk a little bit about this quote and maybe also Eric's quote, which I think is pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love the free puppy quote, because that is 100% a great way to convey the potential hidden costs of open source, right? The phrase I've heard thrown around is free as in freedom, not as in beer. So the idea is that open source is free for you to use however you want. You can see the code, you can contribute back to the code, you can edit the code. Depending on the license, you can probably edit the code and keep those edits private to yourself. You can use it, generally speaking, for most of the more permissive licenses, any way that you want. You have the freedom to do what you want with the software. But it's not free as in beer, in the sense that you are going to pay one way or another with your time, with money, or potentially with headaches down the line if something is misconfigured, or there are security or reliability issues coming in. That's why I love the puppy angle, because there are unknown unknowns there, right? It could misbehave in ways that you don't understand today as you're implementing the solution. So just keeping that in mind as you pull an open source solution off the shelf and put it into practice, I think is super important. Just knowing that this is not free in terms of cost.
Awesome. So I want to encourage people to start just dropping any other questions that they have into the chat. But while people are doing that, can you sort of tie it up in a nice little bow and give us, that high level summary of the difference between, the commercial versus, free software cost profile?
For sure. Yeah. I'll reiterate, I'm a big fan of open source. I love the open source ecosystem. I love that, as a developer, there are, thousands of solutions out there for any problem I might face when developing an application. But like we said, the cost of adopting any of those applications can be unbounded and very tricky to measure. And so what I would say is that a commercial partner really allows you to replace those very unpredictable prices and potentially hidden costs with a very fixed, predictable, measurable cost. Something per month or per year, or something that scales with your usage, things like that. It's generally much easier to predict those costs when there's somebody else taking care of all the nitty-gritty details, and you can just kind of rely on them.
Awesome.
Of course,
Nope.
I was going to say there's also some great additional benefits to having a commercial partner too, where you can have an influence over their roadmap, get quick support on things like that. If you do run into an issue, you can contact their team, et cetera, depending on your support agreement with them. But I think the way I would wrap it up in a sentence is that with a commercial partner, your engineers are free to focus on delivering valuable features to your users. They're free to focus on your core competency rather than having to do all this kind of undifferentiated work, setting up solutions for things that have been solved by other people.
Awesome. So just quick high level again on the spaces that Fairwinds can help. If it's appealing to folks, we'd love to hear from you. Certainly, we have Insights, which is our commercial software offering. We have audit and prove services to help you evaluate where you are and where you want to go. And then we have managed service and advisory services. And we have a bunch of questions coming in. So, Robert, if you're cool with it, I'm going to just jump over there.
Please.
Charlene, if I'm supposed to be pausing here, I expect you're going to jump in and tell me.
No. You're doing great. You're doing great. I do want just a quick reminder to the audience, though, that there's plenty of time for questions. We are only at 30 minutes past the hour, so yay for that. If you do have a question, go ahead and use the question and answer tab and submit it. You can also use the chat tab. That's fine. We're cool with that. Just go ahead and get it on in, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Again, I'm going to take myself off camera, so I'm not distracting you guys. So.
All right, so let's see. This one's big, so I'm going to read it slowly so you can think about your response. Did you really want to say rely on open source and other vendor supplied products? We've seen many cases where reliance on open source to do their function without malware or added attacks surfacing, I think it means, has not been a good idea. Shouldn't we start questioning every open source as a potential detriment as well? That's the point of your webinar, right? It's just the expectation that open source will just work, cost us the most potentially.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think the big thing you want to avoid is believing that open source is going to just work and you're never going to have to do anything, in the future once it's up and running. I'll reiterate, I love open source. I built my career around open source. I think it's great that, it's out there and that, people are putting software out there, for free for other people to use and modify at will. It is, but like you mentioned here, there are potential security issues. You have to consider it, a potential vector for attack. You have to, make sure you're taking into account all the security considerations that are there. Hopefully we've outlined a lot of the questions you should be asking yourself as you adopt an open source product to rely on. But there's just a lot of unknown unknowns, especially depending on which solution you're trying, which problem you're trying to solve, and which solution you adopt. So I think having a plan ahead of time as you go about adopting a solution is really important.
Awesome, and I'm gonna move on to this last slide just so that folks can grab that link because it looks clickable, but it's not through this interface. So you have time to grab it. I think it'll come through potentially in the end as well, but I want to give folks an opportunity there. So we have another question, and it might be for me. Do you have cost estimates calculations for engineer weeks? And I'm not sure if this person is asking, like, how do you do those calculations? But it's going to be dependent on the cost of your engineering staff, right? So where they're located, what their level is, et cetera. And then in terms of duration, it's, and Robert, jump in if I'm going afield here, it's going to be dependent on experience. If you have someone who's very experienced, they're probably more expensive, so they can do something faster, so less time and space, but more, cost per hour to you internally. And then you also have to look at your opportunity cost. If somebody is working on, standing up a piece of software, what are they not working on as a result?
Yeah, I think the opportunity cost part is really important to highlight, because if your engineers are spending all their time just working on infrastructure and kind of the boring problems, then they're not developing new cool features for your users, and you're not making any progress against your roadmap. So ensuring that you're not spinning your wheels, reinventing the wheel, with your most skilled engineers, especially. The other thing I'll point out here is that generally speaking, especially if you're solving a really mission critical problem, then you are probably going to want to put one of your more skilled engineers on the problem. They'll have the instincts around, learning about a new piece of software, where the landmines might be, what to look out for, rather than putting somebody more junior on it.
So I think there's a follow-up. Thank you for the clarification. So how do you calculate engineering effort? What happens if engineers are not all dedicated to the Kubernetes project? How do you divide their time? Robert, you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I would say it's really hard. Is probably the most accurate answer I could give you. It's I would say, it's up to you to figure out, whether you want one person focused on it full time or multiple people focused on it part time. And the really hard thing to calculate, I would say, is, what are the long-term costs? Is there going to be an onboarding cost to every new engineer to learn about your implementation of Kubernetes, and about Kubernetes itself? There's just a lot of questions you need to ask yourself in terms of the amount of time and engineering effort that's going to go into building the solution. Hopefully that better addresses the question, but feel free to follow up again if there's more we can add.
So we've got another one here. I'm kind of excited about this one. Sort of pressing you to dig in a little bit. So oftentimes open source is not free because you have to invest your time. So you seem to forget that you need to put your time into proprietary as well, I think is what this means. It just works is even more of a lie with a commercial software, and then costs unravel and you're locked in.
That's a really good point, and lock-in is definitely something to keep in mind if you're going with a commercial product. I do want to, I guess, as an aside to this question, highlight the difference between commercial software and having a commercial partner for an open source solution. So commercial software, yeah, there's a big lock-in cost there. You could potentially, if you decide to go with a commercial partner and it doesn't work out, that could potentially be a very big headache. On the flip side, though, if you go with a commercial partner for a piece of open source software, that lock-in issue goes away. And really all you're getting is upside from the commercial partner, right? Because you're still using the same open source software you would be using yourself, but they're layering on expertise on top of that, support on top of that. They're helping you navigate how to really effectively deploy that open source inside your organization. But I think more to the point of your question, there is still, cost in terms of adopting commercial software or even, a commercial partner for open source, right? There's going to be some information sharing that needs to happen. There's always, still setup costs with any kind of commercial software out there. What I will say though is that the commercial partner is going to be incentivized to make sure that you're successful. They're economically incentivized to make sure that you get value out of their product or out of their services. Whereas the open source community, they do their best for sure, but open source projects are often run by teams of volunteers. They don't get any upside when a new user adopts their product or project. So they're not particularly well incentivized to help you out beyond go above and beyond the normal open source call of duty of responding to issues and maybe taking a look at pull requests and things like that. So having somebody whose incentives are aligned with yours, I think is a really big plus to having a commercial partner.
So along those same lines, I think this question sits. So in what cases does it make sense to just go with open source and not use a commercial partner? So I think it means stand up on your own.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's I want to be clear. There's a lot of cases where that is the case. I would say offhand, if the problem is very well constrained, say you just want a something to help you manage CSS on your front end, you're probably fine going with just the off-the-shelf open source. You probably don't need a commercial partner to help you set up Bootstrap or something like that. It's so if the problem is very, very tightly constrained, open source works great. I would say also if it's not mission critical, if it's just something that's part of your development environment, something you're toying around with, something that's gonna maybe you're setting up a Grafana instance, say, to get some visualization of your user data, things like that. And if it goes down for a week, nobody's going to really care. That's totally, on the table for something where you could just go with the off the shelf open source. I would say where you really need to start thinking about a commercial partner is if it's mission critical, if it's a really big, hairy problem, if you feel like you would need to develop an in-house expert on the problem in order to do it yourself, you're probably not playing to your core competency, and you should probably try and bring in an expert from the outside.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm just reading these questions here. Let's see. Does the size of your business, enterprise versus startup, and there's like a whole lot in between there, right? That's my commentary. Affect the decision in terms of what direction you go?
Yeah, I would say it absolutely does. I would say if you're a startup, you're probably scrappy. You probably don't need to be paying a commercial partner. It's your needs are probably also much more similar to the needs of others. You probably don't have like strict compliance requirements. You probably don't have a very complicated environment that's going to need to be adapted to the open source solution. So I would say if you are a startup, generally speaking, you will probably be more likely to go with the open source solution. As you get bigger, your problems become a little bit hairier, a little bit more complicated, a little harder to deal with, just using like kind of off the shelf, quick start instructions, things like that. That's when you really want to start developing some expertise, or using a partner to leverage their expertise. And at the point that you're a large enterprise, I think it makes sense, almost 100% of the time, to have a commercial partner on board helping you solve the problem. Just because the cost of a security incident, if you're a Fortune 500 company, can be weeks of bad press. The cost of an outage can be millions of dollars in revenue. It's the costs just go up so much when you're operating at that level of scale that it just makes sense to have somebody in your back pocket who can give you support, who can give you help, and who can advise you on your usage of the software.
So you sort of just answered this, but I'm going to ask the explicit question anyway. Can you give an example of an open source solution leading to a costly security incident? So you gave some sort of high level, but any specificity you want to add there?
Yeah, so I did mention earlier there was a recent Kubernetes issue where people had misconfigured Kubernetes and they left it basically exposed so that anybody could log in from the internet as a whole, and people installed crypto mining software on their Kubernetes clusters. That actually seems to be the favorite way to attack a Kubernetes cluster, is to start mining Bitcoin using that Kubernetes cluster. I mean, other examples might be maybe a year or two ago, there was a Node.js package that was very widely used. I want to say millions of installs. It was a simple little package. Ownership changed hands, and the new owner installed a little bit of malware in there, and it was released as a patch version. Most people hadn't pinned their version to a very specific version, and they automatically pulled in that issue and pulled in that malware. So open source can be a a big threat vector. The nice thing about open source is that because the code is all public, and it's generally very widely used, those security issues do get spotted very quickly. But the big thing is making sure you're staying up to date, because once they're fixed, I should say once they're known, it's very easy for people to exploit them. So making sure you're staying on top of those updates, watching those CVE feeds and things like that, to make sure that you aren't you don't have a security vulnerability in place that everybody knows about and is knows how to exploit.
Awesome. So I don't see any other questions. If you have any folks have any other final thoughts, we'd love to hear them. But I see Charlene.
Yeah. So if you do have any other questions, we'll leave the question and answers tab open a little bit longer to see if we get any stragglers in, or if you just have any final thoughts. As Elisa said, go ahead and use the chat. We'd love to see your chats. And also a quick reminder, guys, that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. All right, looks like we are not getting any more questions in. So I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. There were some really good ones there. And I'm sure Elisa and Robert would agree with me on that. But again, if you do have a last minute question, go ahead and just put it in. If we don't address it during this webinar, please know that the folks at Fairwinds are getting a copy of all of the questions that came in. And I'm sure somebody from the organization will be more than happy to follow up with you guys offline to get your question answered. And I did mention at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that real quick. That looks like. All right, our first Amazon winner today is Juan S. Congratulations, Juan. Our second winner today is Bruno C. Congratulations, Bruno. Our third winner today is Debbie U. Congratulations, Debbie. And our final winner today is Andre Y. Congratulations, Andre. We'll be following up with all 4 of you offline by email to get your gift card over to you. So check your inbox. If you don't see anything in your inbox, please check your spam folder. All right, Elisa and Robert, thank you both for a great presentation. Lots of great stuff. And I guess I'm happy to give folks a few minutes back in their day. So I do want to thank you for your time. You guys are great. Thank you very much. All right. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.